So, in trying to define what is grief, grief is a natural internal response to the death of someone significant. It can also be in response to other types of loss, which Dora is going to discuss later on today. So, I'm not going to be covering that. I'm going to be talking specifically about loss from death. Grief is unique and multifaceted. It can encompass a wide range of symptoms and reactions, which we talked about a little bit earlier if you were there for the panel. I find that this understanding can bring both relief and frustration. And I really liked this quote. Each person's grief is like all other person's grief. Each person's grief is like some other person's grief. And each person's grief is like no other person's grief. And that can all be true at the same time. So when you think of grief, what comes to mind for you? Think about it. Like, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the word grief? Mm-hmm. And if you want to, you can shout out your answers. Death, yeah. Loneliness. She said sorrow. I don't know if you heard her down here. Loss, yeah. Yeah. When you think about the experience of grief, like what it feels like to grieve, or what is that like? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Sadness, loneliness.
She said emptiness.
Emptiness. Painful, yeah. Confused, yeah. I think when I first did this exercise, the first thing I thought of was sadness and tears. That's what I think of when I think of grief. And I think for many people, this is true. However, as we've mentioned, grief is also individual and unique. And so grief reactions can impact more than our emotions. It can include social reactions, cognitive reactions, behavioral reactions, and spiritual reactions as well. Also, there's just individual differences. There's personality differences. Some people have overt, loud, passionate reactions. Others have a more muted or internal reaction to the loss. In other words, if you were looking at them, you might not know they're grieving, but their grief is just as real as someone who is overtly demonstrating their grief through tears. So while tears may be what we expect, at least it was for me, some may experience grief as irritability or physical pain, confusion, and forgetfulness. So now I'm going to just talk about some of the different reactions you may experience, just to kind of keep in mind how individual this can be and what a wide range of reactions are possible when you're grieving. So there's emotions. Y'all named many of these. So sadness, yearning and longing is also one of the ones that's very common, that sense of just wanting to be with the person again. Shock also is pretty common, especially in the beginning. Even if you expected the death, shock can still be there. Anger, love, fear and anxiety, guilt, depends on the circumstances, jealousy, hopelessness, and some even experience relief, especially if the person was dying and maybe was in a lot of pain. There can be a sense of relief that this person isn't suffering anymore. Also, you can have more than one feeling at the same time. And so that can be confusing as well, that you can experience relief and yearning at the same time. I'm relieved they're not suffering, but at the same time, I want to be with them again, right now, here. So another reaction is physical and behavioral reactions. So you may experience headaches, muscle aches, fatigue, and exhaustion when I'm working with those who are grieving. Most of them, if not all of them, talk to me about the fatigue and the exhaustion, just the tiredness they experience. There can be pain. There can be tightness in the throat or chest, crying. There can be withdrawal from activities. There can be overactivity. I'm going to stay as busy as possible. There can be angry outbursts. There can even be uses of humor. Cognitive reactions you may experience, so a sense of disbelief, especially in the beginning, very common. I'm going to talk about one of the frameworks for grief, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Difficulty concentrating or focusing. You may experience confusion, feeling like you're on autopilot, like you're present, but you're not fully present, going through the motions. You're kind of here, but not. You may experience intrusive thoughts or memories of the person who died or the circumstances of that death. You may idolize the person who died. You may demonize the person who died. And I added this last one. I did this yesterday as I was looking through this. I was like, I didn't do the main one, because most people wonder if they were going crazy when they're grieving, especially if it's their first time to go through grief, and if this is the death of someone significant for you. There can be a sense of, am I losing my mind? Because you can feel so different from how you normally feel and how you normally think when you are grieving. And then spiritual reactions, which we've also mentioned. So you may experience a renewal in your faith, comfort in your faith, but you may also experience doubt and disbelief or changes in your beliefs. And you may have many, many questions. For example, like, why? So you may be wrestling through. So those are all different ways that grief can impact us, not beyond just the emotional. Does grief have a timeline? Does it end? In fact, grief is usually permanent after someone we love dies. This is even with healthy coping and adapting. There is no time after which we expect people to stop grieving. And I pulled this from the Center for Prolonged Grief, and I'm going to touch on that. I mentioned it earlier in the panel. Even with prolonged grief, the goal isn't, when they're providing treatment for prolonged grief, the goal isn't to get you to not be grieving, because grief after someone dies is permanent. But there is adapting that we can do, which I'm going to talk about. The reality is that you will grieve forever. And this is from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who you may be familiar with. You may have heard of the stages, and I'm going to briefly hit on those as well. But this is from her book with David Kessler on grief and grieving, which I have down here. By the way, I brought most of my books with me that I use, so if after this you want to come look at the books, you're welcome to. I always like to do that. I want to flip through things and see what's in there. The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal, and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same. Nor would you want to. I really like, you will be whole again, but you will never be the same. It's both. So grief doesn't end, but does it change? Yes. Yes, it does. Short answer. In the beginning, grief can be very intense and dominate your life. Some think of this as like acute grief, and there really isn't a timeline for acute grief, but just at the very beginning, grief can be highly stressful, draining, and painful. Grief doesn't go away, but it does change. And typically it's the intensity of grief which lessens over time. The timeline on this varies, but most find ways to slowly accept the reality of the death and adapt to this new reality over time. And by the way, it's not just time. It's not just time passing. I think it's if you have support, if you are taking care of yourself, and I'm going to talk about that in ways that you can. So there are things we can do along the journey that will help us. But in this sense, healing is learning and adapting to this new life while also remembering and loving the one who died. What if it's not changing? So this is where prolonged grief disorder comes in. And so this is grief that continues to be intense and pervasive, disrupting everyday life for longer than a year. So they don't even begin this diagnosis until a year has passed. So I just want to make that clear. That does not mean, if you're still grieving after a year, that you have prolonged grief disorder. Remember, grief doesn't end. So of course you're going to be grieving after a year. My dad died in 2017. I am still grieving. So, but this is different. This is often described as feeling stuck or frozen in time. There's been no change. There's been no adapting. The intensity at the very beginning is the same intensity a year later or more. It could be 2 years later. It's the same level of intensity and disruption to your life. There's been no change or movement in it. Those with prolonged grief find it difficult to think about or concentrate on anything else, and relationships with others also suffer. Those with prolonged grief often report feeling lost and alone. So, we touched on this a little bit, but what kinds of support are available? So each person, because each person's grief is unique and individual, it's going to vary on what kind of support they need. So some may have enough support through friends, family, and community. Others may benefit from books on grief. That information about grief and what's normal may be really helpful in their grief process. Others may seek the support of a grief support group or counseling. For those who are experiencing prolonged grief, it's generally recommended that they seek help from a licensed mental health professional. I also put in here, if you have a history of depression or bipolar disorder, I think it's wise to consult with a licensed mental health professional. Okay, so now I'm going to move into frameworks for understanding grief. Like right in front of that screen, just like reading it. So I'll try to move around so it's, You may have heard of the stages of grief. How many of y'all are familiar with the stages of grief? I feel like that's one that like most people have heard of. I'm not going to cover it too much because of that, because you're probably heard of it before. But this is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who she helped found the hospice movement that we have here, and she studied the stages of dying, and so these are the stages of dying, so denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, and later those stages were applied to grief. I think there can be a lot of benefit in looking at the stages. A lot of people find that it helps them make sense of what they're going through. But I do want to caution that the stages are meant to be tools to help us frame what we may be experiencing in grief. It's not supposed to be a linear timeline, and they're not supposed to be universal stages that everyone will go through. This is from her book. So in her final book, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Kessler write that the stages have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grieving is as individual as our lives. All right, so another framework to keep in mind is grieving styles. And so Doka and Martin presented or identified 4 grieving styles. They actually, I think when they started this, they were trying to identify if there were gender differences in grieving, and the styles came from that. But then they realized it wasn't a gender difference. These are just 4 grieving styles. And so you may have heard of this before in another, they talked about it like heart. Okay, so we have heart and head, and heart versus head. It's also been called, heart has also been called intuitive. Head was called instrumental. And so you may have heard it in that language as well. I'm going to go into these a little bit more. Heart. You tend to experience, express, and cope with grief more emotionally. So you have strong feelings of grief, especially in the beginning, which many describe as waves of emotion. You will probably experience, but not necessarily, but you will probably experience emotional exhaustion, feeling tired, and low energy. You may be prone to forgetting about your self-care needs, like eating, exercise, sleep. And you benefit from opportunities to express and explore your emotions. So a support group might be very beneficial for you. A lot of times support groups will explore emotions and how you're doing in that sense. So this is one of the styles of grieving. There we go. The next one is head. You tend to experience, express, and adapt to grief in more cognitive and active ways. Your feelings may be muted, not absent, but muted, especially in comparison to somebody who experiences more heart. And you may experience more confusion, irritability, inability to concentrate, and disorganized thoughts. Because you tend to experience it more in cognitive ways, then this is why you may experience more confusion, inability to concentrate, and disorganized thoughts. You may find it useful to return to work earlier because the rhythm may be helpful to you in your coping. You may also dose your grief, meaning you set aside time or activities to focus on it. Okay, so support groups that focus on emotions may be uncomfortable and not as beneficial for you. Some support groups do a really good job of trying to kind of expand it beyond emotions, and so all the different ways that you may be impacted. But if you're in a group where they're really focusing in on emotions, which would be really beneficial to somebody who's a heart griever, you may not benefit as much. In fact, it could be really uncomfortable if they're talking about how they're feeling, and they ask you, well, how are you feeling? And you're like, well, I've been thinking about them a lot, and I've been trying to think of ways that I can honor them. And they're like, yeah, but how have you been feeling? And you're like, well, I don't know, I guess okay. But I've really just been thinking about it a lot. Every time I'm in my car, I'm thinking about them. It could just be uncomfortable. So reading books on grief may benefit you more. Getting information on the grieving process may really benefit you. I found this example in Worden's book. I was approached after the meeting. So Worden is a professor and a researcher who studies grief, and I won't go into that. I was going to grab the book and tell you what it was titled, but I'll talk about that later if I have time. I was approached after the meeting, so he went and presented at a workshop on grief. I was approached after the meeting by a young woman wanting to talk about her family. Her parents had recently lost an infant, and she and her mother were grieving the loss, but she was afraid that her father was not grieving. She was concerned he might not adequately grieve, and as a result, have an arrested grief reaction. As I spoke with her, I learned that the father had asked to carry the tiny casket on his shoulders all the way from the church, through the town, out to the cemetery. His daughter said that ever since the death, the father, a farmer, had spent long hours out on his tractor alone in the fields. It was my sense that her father was doing his grieving, but he was doing it in his own way, and my hunch was later confirmed in a letter from her. So here we have a father who is, I'm going to just guess, is thinking about his child, and so he is grieving. It's just, it looks different than how the mother and the daughter are grieving. And then there's also those who are more of a combination. You can have both. So you experience both the emotions and the cognitions, and you move back and forth between them. I don't think it's really as important to, am I heart and head? It's helpful. I really wanted to present this just so we could acknowledge that there are many different ways that people may experience grief, and not to assume that if somebody is a head griever or more prone to this, that it is to assume that that means they're not grieving or that they're suppressing it. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. But there is this fourth style, which, I do want to say this. Heart, and head, these are all valid styles. There's not a style that's better than the other. I'm not trying to, when I'm sitting with somebody, I'm not trying to get them to be one style over another. These are all valid ways of grieving. I have an example here. I was working with a teenager, and I gave a quiz to him and his brother. And the question was, if we do not have a strong reaction to a death, it means we did not care about the person who died, true or false? And the teenager said, well, this one's false. But he said, but it's hard. And I said, well, tell me more. And he said, well, my mom, she cries a lot. And he said, and I really haven't. I haven't really cried. And he was like, and I haven't really felt like I needed to. And he said, and I know they're wondering if I'm grieving or if I cared. But he was like, I'm thinking about him all the time. And so he's grieving differently from the members of his family. And it can look like maybe they're not, but it looks different. Now, there can be a disconnection, so in case you're wondering. So heart versus head, this is where there is a disconnection between what you're experiencing and what you're expressing. And this can be due to different things. It can be temporary, maybe there's just a lot you need to do, and so if you're a heart griever, you're just putting those emotions on hold for now because you have a lot you need to get through, and then later the emotions come. But it could also be a lifelong pattern where perhaps you're in a family where emotions were not encouraged, and so you've just learned to suppress that. So that can happen. I just don't assume that's what's happening when somebody's sitting in front of me. Hope that makes sense. Okay, the last one I'm going to do for the frameworks is the task of mourning, and this is one of my favorite frameworks for thinking about grief. Dora is also going to cover my other favorite, which is, I'll let her cover that. So Worden provides a framework, and rather than a stage model, he proposed 4 tasks that an individual works through in grief, and I'm going to go through each of these tasks one by one, and I'll try to do it slowly, in case you want to take notes. So task number 1 is to accept the reality of the loss. When someone dies, even if the death is expected, there is always a sense that it hasn't happened. The first task of grieving is to come full face with the reality that the person is dead, that the person is gone, and will not return. And that can take time. Coming to an acceptance of the reality of the loss takes time, since it involves not only an intellectual acceptance, but also an emotional one. So we can know, but also there's a part of us that doesn't know. And so this is part of this task of accepting the reality that this person who was in my life is no longer physically present here anymore. Even, I think I said this earlier, but even when you expect the death, it can be shocking because there's just something about someone you love not being physically present anymore that's just shocking. And so the opposite of this task, so the opposite of accepting the reality of the loss, is not believing through some type of denial. Some people refuse to believe that the death is real and get stuck in this mourning process at the first task. And we kind of touched on some of this, and maybe this is how to speed it up. And so some examples of disbelief. And some of these are, this is just like part of the process. This is part of working through this task. Here's an example. A woman wakes up and reaches over to her deceased husband's side of the bed. She knows he won't be there intellectually, but there was hope that maybe he would be, even though he died many months ago. This is someone who's working their way through task 1. I've worked with kids before, and sometimes, especially in the beginning, they pretend that their person is away on a trip rather than my dad died. They pretend. And so this is, again, a child who's working their way through task 1. Wanting to pick up the phone, I think this is one that a lot of people experience, wanting to pick up the phone to share some experience, only to remember that the one who died cannot answer the phone, like you're not going to be able to talk to them. So it's a very common experience. And again, it's part of this learning to accept the reality that this has happened. One of the things that helps us with this is our rituals, such as funerals and memorials. They can help with acceptance, help make this reality real. However, there's not a timeline for how long this task should take. Some cycle in and out of acceptance for a time. Just the other day, I think I was telling Janet back there, I have a family I was working with, and the dad died. And after he died, I think it was probably a couple of months later that I woke up and I was kind of thinking through my day, and I realized I was going to be seeing that family later, and it just kind of hit me like, the dad is never going to be in the waiting room. Like, I'm not going to see him anymore. Like, I knew he died, but like, I'm never going to see him in the waiting room. And so, again, this is like me working through task 1. So task 2, once you've accepted reality, then comes the pain of that reality. So task number 2 is to process the pain of grief. And this pain can include physical pain and emotional pain. Not everyone experiences the same intensity of pain or feels it in the same way, but usually there is some kind of pain when you lose someone that you were deeply attached to. The opposite of this task is not feeling or acknowledging the pain. And there are things that can interrupt this task, which we briefly touched on earlier, and mainly this is through avoidance. You avoid reminders that this has happened, about what happened or about the person who died, or you avoid the pain by numbing it through various ways. And so these are things that can delay working through and processing the pain. In other words, numbing the pain is a way to get stuck in task 2. Task 3 is to adjust to a world without the person. And there are many different kinds of adjustments that we work through in task number 3. There's external, there's internal, and then there's potentially spiritual. External is your everyday functioning in the world, and this depends on who died and what your relationship was with them. It could require developing new skills or taking on new roles. So, for example, if it was a spouse who died, you may need to learn new skills or take on roles that this person did in your life. So the question is, what will my life look like now? Internally, also your sense of self may be different or may be adjusting without this person. So who are you now? How can you feel safe? And then spiritually, your beliefs, values, and assumptions about the world may be challenged. And again, not every death challenges this, but some do. And so, for example, we usually have some assumptions about the world, not always, but like the world is a safe place, the world makes sense. Some deaths challenge that, where you're like, I don't know if the world is a safe place. I don't know if the world makes sense. And so you're working through these beliefs, or these challenges to these beliefs. And then the last task is task 4, to find a way to remember the deceased while embarking on the rest of one's journey through life. And this task has really changed over the years. Because at first, the task was like to kind of like move on. That was task number 4, like move on into life. But now the goal of this task is to remember the person who died. It's not to forget, it's to remember the person who died and also continue living. So incompletion of this task would look like not living, as if one's life had stopped with the death and not continued. So once again, healing and grief is not about forgetting. It is understanding the complex ways you retain a continuing bond to the person you love. When a person dies, if it's somebody that you loved, when a person dies, your love doesn't die. Like your love is still there. And so part of my goal as a counselor is to help people remember their person while also being able to live their life in a way that's healthy. And so, all right, so now I'm going to briefly, do I stop at 11:30? Is that right? Okay, cool. Do we have any questions right now before I keep on going? I'm happy to keep going. I'm gonna, I didn't see any hands, so, oh, you? Can I hand you the mic?
My question is about the, I guess you call it styles of grieving. How would you counsel people who maybe have suffered the same loss and are grieving at the same time, but don't necessarily grieve in the same way, and because of that, tend to trigger each other? How would you counsel that relationship?
That is such a good question. And I would say that's true for most families that I work with, if not all the families that I've worked with. First, I like to teach that there are different ways of grieving, and so just informing them of that. So providing some education on that. And I think usually it involves finding a compromise that works for everybody. So for example, maybe for one family member, looking at pictures is really comforting, and there are pictures everywhere. But for another family member, that is triggering. They walk into that room and they feel overwhelmed by all the photos everywhere. So perhaps a compromise we could work on is maybe moving some of those photos, so they're not everywhere. They're in certain places so that the one who is comforted can still go and be comforted by the photos, but the one who is triggered by the photos doesn't have to be exposed to it all the time. Does that make sense? And so a lot of times it's just working with that family and trying to figure out how can we find a compromise that'll work for everybody so that everybody is able to have their needs met without feeling overwhelmed and triggered. Did that answer your question? Partially? Yeah. Any other questions? And we can talk more if you... Would you like to ask more? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to jump into types of loss. This is in no way, shape, or form all of the types of loss at all. This is a very, very brief list of losses, actually. like I said, I had an hour, so I knew I wasn't going to be able to cover all the different kinds of losses. And so I picked these, not because, well, a lot of times we compare when we're talking about losses, and I want to really encourage you not to do that. Or if you find try not to do that. Because I want to recognize that every loss is important and painful and worthy of compassion. And so I'm highlighting these, not because these are the most painful or the only ones that deserve to be highlighted, but I'm actually choosing to highlight these because I find that we don't talk about them as much, and I would like to bring them out into the light. So disenfranchised grief, which Dora is also going to talk about more. The question is, what happens when you have a loss but you do not receive social support for that loss? According to Kendoka, disenfranchised grief results when a loss cannot be openly acknowledged, it's not socially sanctioned, and it's not publicly mourned. This can happen for a number of reasons. Perhaps the loss isn't seen as worthy of grief, like, for example, a non-death loss, which again, Dora is going to cover more. Perhaps the relationship is stigmatized. Maybe the person who died was an abusive spouse, and so that's harder to talk about. It's harder for people to lean in and maybe offer support for that. Perhaps the mechanism of death is stigmatized. Perhaps it's a death by suicide. Perhaps it's an overdose. Perhaps the person grieving is not recognized as a griever. Like, it's a relationship that you wouldn't normally think would cause grief, like a coworker or an ex-partner, something like that. And so the point of this is people may not as readily offer support because they're not even aware that support's needed. Or maybe the way someone is grieving is stigmatized. Maybe there's an absence of outward grief, or it's extreme, and so people are uncomfortable. What happens is, instead of messages of consolation and support, people may instead say hurtful or insensitive things to a grieving person when there's disenfranchised grief. And in turn, they might not feel entitled to acknowledge and express their thoughts and emotions fully with themselves or with others, which can lead to feelings of guilt, shame, and embarrassment. So basically what ends up happening is the griever ends up alone. They feel like they can't turn to others and get the support that they need, and this can complicate the grieving process. And so Janet mentioned her own experience of people saying some things that were very, very hurtful, and so this can add to the pain of grief. So one type of loss that I don't hear talked about as much is loss during pregnancy, and so this is any death that occurs during a pregnancy. And it's been my experience and the experience of other counselors I know that this type of loss can be minimized and even unrecognized. While this may be an experience many share, pregnancy loss is real and painful. I pulled some quotes from a book, and sometimes I think the most impactful thing for me is hearing from people who have gone through it. And so I pulled these quotes. First quote, "People will say you were lucky it happened early, or that you should be glad you weren't too attached." Yeah, you can imagine, but you know that baby was yours the moment that second line appeared on the pregnancy test. So when you grieve, you not only grieve for the weeks or months you had with your baby, you grieve all the days and all the memories you'll never get to have. And then the next one, a friend said to me, "Why are you grieving? You are a doctor and you should know better. Miscarriages happen." Yes, miscarriages happen, but you don't expect that you will lose your baby to a miscarriage. I would also say that knowing something will happen is not the same thing as experiencing that happening. I pulled this one from a magazine that I held on to because I thought it was so beautifully said. This is a husband writing about his wife, and during her first pregnancy, she had a miscarriage. Maybe it's too obvious to even mention, but you see and know someone in a new light when you walk through the darkness of death with them. I always knew, along with everyone else, that Sarah was kind and funny and gentle, but I don't think I knew her as confident until I watched her grieve our first baby. No matter how many people told us it was common, Sarah refused to sweep it under the rug. No matter how many people told us we would have more babies, Sarah refused to move on. She felt and still feels that our first baby's death was worthy of grief. She was confident in being broken and in knowing that the world is not somehow as it should be, confident that her grief was worthwhile, and she was going to walk through it. She wanted that baby, she loved that baby, and she would miss that baby. Okay, so when we're supporting somebody who has experienced a pregnancy loss, here are some things not to say. Please do not say, everything happens for a reason. They're in a better place. I know exactly how you feel. Heaven needed another angel. You need to be grateful for what you have. You need to move on. You can always adopt. At least you were young. At least you have other children. At least you can try again. Okay, so what can we say or do instead? So remember, healing is not about forgetting. It's not about moving on. And it's not about getting over it. Instead, it's about being heard, seen, and held. So here's a quote. It helped me to be with people who gave me that quiet understanding. A friend who came with a meal, sat with me, and let me cry without providing a catchphrase meant more to me than any platitude. Time. I have a friend who, this was many, many years ago, but during one of her pregnancies, she realized she was having a miscarriage, and she was at home, and her husband was there, and she called me, and she asked me if I would come over, and I did, and the miscarriage was actually happening, so she was in a lot of emotional pain and physical pain, and she called me over, I think, because her husband, who loves her and is a great husband, he was trying to comfort her, but the way he was doing it was by trying to explain to her that the miscarriage was probably happening because there was something wrong with the baby, and this was God's way of taking care of it. This was not comforting her. This was angering. She was getting angry and frustrated and feeling more in pain. And so she had called me over, and again, she knew her husband loved her. I think what was happening was he was trying to give to her what was comforting him. Does that make sense? So you may have heard of, I think I used this the other day, Janet, the love languages. And so when you first, are y'all familiar with the love languages? Okay. Before you know about those, you just think, this is the way I give and receive love, right? Gifts mean so much to me. I'm going to give gifts to everybody, and this must be the way everybody receives love. Until you learn, no, there's actually other ways that people receive love. And so I think sometimes what we do is the thing that brings us comfort, we try to give that to others without realizing that may not be the thing that brings that person comfort. So for my friend's husband, I think that understanding was really helping him in that moment of crisis. But for her, she just needed somebody to sit and be with her and let her cry and just be with her and let her feel what she was feeling. So how to help? We want to acknowledge their loss. And this can be as simple as, I was so sorry to hear about your loss. We want to validate their pain. This is so hard. I can see how much this baby means to you. And then you want to show them that you care. I'm here. Would you like to tell me about your baby? Would you like to share what this has been like for you? You're trying to convey, I'm here, I love you, and I'd love to hear about your baby. Okay, I'm going to move into suicide loss. So suicide is defined as death caused by self-directed, injurious behavior with intent to die as a result of the behavior. In the US, over 49,000 people died by suicide in 2022, and that is one death every 11 minutes. This type of death can be complex and traumatic for survivors. Survivors often need more support, but may receive less support. And so the feelings of anger, rejection, and abandonment are especially intense and difficult to sort out after a suicide. In general, when offering support, please do not ask about the method the person used to end their life. You may be curious about that, but please do not ask. And also try not to offer hollow reassurance. Again, these are more platitudes, but At least he's no longer suffering. At least things will get better. Instead, the bereaved person may feel like you don't want to acknowledge or hear them express their pain and their grief. Please do, though. And I really liked this one. I thought it summed it up really well. The survivor may be searching for answers, but your role as somebody who's supporting them for the foreseeable future is simply to be supportive and listen to what they have to say about the person, the death, and their thoughts and feelings. So you do not need to go searching for answers. You do not need to figure out things. It's to be supportive and to listen to them. And follow the survivor's lead when broaching sensitive topics. This is assuming you feel like you can listen in detail. If you feel like I can't, then don't ask. But you can ask if you feel like you can. Would you like to talk about what happened? And some may, and some may not. Like, be okay with their answer either way. They may feel like talking. They may not want to talk about it at all. They may just want to sit and watch TV with you. It is okay to not know what to say, and I would say this is true for most when we're trying to support somebody who is grieving, even more generally beyond a suicide loss. It's okay to not know what to say. So something like, I don't know what to say, but I care about you and I want to be here for you will be a lot more meaningful for someone than a platitude. And then also, I think Dora mentioned this, rather than saying, let me know if I can help, offer to do something specific for them, because a lot of times they're not able to think through, like, what do I need? Like, they don't have the capacity to be able to come up with things, even though they are in need. And so a lot of times just offering to help them is much more helpful for those who are grieving. Specifically with suicide, there are groups and different things that they can join if they're needing extra support specifically for suicide loss. And so feel free to reach out to me and I can try to help you try to locate that if somebody is in need of one of those. Some of those are online and virtual. I think some of them are in the Dallas area as well. And then sometimes meeting with a professional counselor can help. And so encouraging the person to, that doesn't mean like making them do it, but it does mean you can encourage them to seek the help of a therapist. And a really lovely thing to do would be like to even help them get to the therapist if they're needing help with that as well, if they're open to therapy. So some general tips. Oh man, I'm running out of time. This is just general tips about how to support people who are grieving. We want to acknowledge the importance of the loss by accepting the emotional or cognitive responses of someone who has suffered a loss rather than judging its appropriateness. So they may be grieving very, very differently from how I would be grieving, but this isn't about me. This is about me learning to sit with somebody and support them and be willing to hear them out, however they're experiencing this loss. You may want to encourage adaptive coping responses and self-care, so getting good sleep, eating, spending time with others, enjoying healthy activities. So when my dad had a stroke, and this was in 2017, and he was in the hospital for 3 days. And so essentially we lived in the hospital for 3 days until he died in the hospital. And when you're in the hospital like that, we were living off of the vending machine, I think, and I wasn't even really thinking about food. When you're in that, you're just there. I remember after my dad died, we had a family friend who was there, and I remember him telling me, like, you need to eat an actual meal. And I remember actually feeling a little offended, like, who cares about food right now? Like, what are you talking about? But I remember looking at him and being like, this person cares about me. I'm not thinking about eating, but I probably should eat a meal. And I did it. And I will say I felt better after I did it. And so sometimes it is really helpful to just remind people of these kind of basic self-care things. It's helpful to promote the use of therapeutic, cultural, or religious rituals and supports that they may have, and also support engagement with community and peer support groups. As a friend, you may hear them talk about the death over and over again. If you can remember that task 1 is to accept the reality of the death, this may be helpful, because when you can stay present and listen as they share this over and over again, it's helping them to accept the reality of the death. I also try to remember that I think people can tell when you genuinely care about them, even if you say the wrong thing. And I have before. People can tell when you genuinely care. Something else, when we offer platitudes, usually it does not feel good to the recipient. Keep in mind that they may say some platitudes to themselves, and if it brings some comfort, then that's great. I've had many grieving people tell me they believe everything happens for a reason. But I also understand that not everybody is comforted by this, so this is not something I supply to people. Having faith does not negate grieving. So a friend of mine, she is a woman of faith, and I believe her husband died, and it had been, how long had it been? I want to say about 4 months, maybe longer, but we'll go with 4 months since he had died. And she was talking to a friend one day, and the friend said, like, I don't understand why you're still so sad. Like, you know he's in a better place. You're a woman of faith. Like, you know he's in a better place. Why are you still so sad? I don't understand. And my friend said, well, the person she was talking to was also married. She said, I want you to imagine that you're going to go home tonight. And when you walk through the door, though, your husband's not going to be there, and he's never going to be there again. Ever. You will never see him again physically. That's what I'm going through. And that actually really helped that other person to understand, like, the depth of her pain. Even though she's a woman of faith, she knows he's in a better place. She is still grieving, and she is still in pain because of that. Don't be afraid to speak the name of the person who died unless you're asked not to. If they ask you not to, then don't. But most people, I think, are grateful for the opportunity to reminisce and talk about their person who died. We want to just be there sometimes. Sit with them, watch TV or a movie, listen to music, go for a walk. I mean, in other words, be there. And then also keep inviting them, because they may decline a lot. You may invite them to something, they may say okay, and then they may call right before the thing and say, I'm not going to be able to do that. They may have forgotten about it, they may be really tired, they may just feel like they need to be alone for the night. Keep inviting them. It means a lot to them. We want to be patient. This experience has changed their life forever. The weeks and months following the funeral, when the initial shock wears off and the full reality of what has happened sinks in, may be the toughest for them. So we want to continue to check in and let them know you were thinking of them, and that you're there for them, and that you want to listen to them. I mentioned I have a friend who still, after years, still calls me on the anniversary of my dad's death to check in on me, and it means so much to me. We still want to be patient, because it takes time for grief to change, and so it's not something we can speed up. So we would not rush physical healing, so why do we rush this healing? Some days will be harder than others. Sometimes you can predict this. About 2 or 3 months after the death is often a difficult time. Usually that's when the busyness after the death has kind of slowed down. Thank you. And so sometimes that time is very hard, because the reality is setting in of what has happened. Also, 1-year anniversaries of the death, birthdays, holidays, and special days can also be extra challenging. And then sometimes there are just hard days that come out of nowhere, and you're not sure why it's a hard day, but it is. I give people permission to cry. Some don't need permission, but some do. And I want them to know it's okay to cry with me. It won't overwhelm me. I may cry too, and that's okay. What I don't want them to do is feel like they need to hold it all together around me. There's something really healing about being able to cry with another person when you need to cry. And that took me practice. Like I was not initially comfortable with that, but over time, as I've sat with more and more people, and as you practice, like, you become more comfortable with tears. Even still, though, I know you probably all want, what are the words that I say that will bring comfort? Because I know I want those words as well, but there really aren't. But I know, I mean, when we go to talk to somebody, I know there can be fears, like, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I say too much? What if I say nothing? What if I cause them to start crying? What if they want to be alone, but here I am? And I was recently at a memorial service, and I felt this all over again because I went up to talk to one of the sons who was there, and I had to think through, what are you going to say? But being there and offering this good grief support, it is the most loving thing you can do. This is a quote from a trauma expert. Numerous studies of disaster response around the globe have shown that social support is the most powerful protection against becoming overwhelmed by stress and trauma. Social support is not the same as being in the presence of others. The critical issue is reciprocity, being truly heard and seen by people around us, feeling that we are held in someone else's mind and heart. For our own physiology to calm down, heal, and grow, we need a visceral feeling of safety. And when you're really present with someone who is grieving, you're helping them to not be alone with it. It doesn't take the pain away, but it does lessen the overwhelm of being alone with that pain. At the end of the day, this is about being willing to walk in the valley with them, and it's really learning how to love one another. There are 2 scriptures that I think about a lot when I'm with those who are grieving and in my own grief. So rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Okay, I have a minute, I think. Quiz answers. So grief is a predictable process. Grief is not predictable. It would be a lot easier if it was. It is individual, right? If I could tell you, this will happen and then this. Number 2, grief does not have a timeline. This is usually an attempt to make the uncontrollable controllable. Grief it's not about letting go. It's actually, hopefully the pain will lessen over time, but really the goal is to remember. It's not so much about forgetting. And then number 4, this is about needing closure. It kind of depends on what you mean by closure, but usually we don't get closure in the sense that there's something we can do to make the grief end. There are things we can do, like I mentioned, like self-care and various things that can help us as we're adapting. The grief is really learning to live with the loss. Number 5, we need to express our emotions of loss in order to reach resolution. This one's interesting. Usually this is referring to the idea that people who openly show and express their emotions are healthier than those who do not, but as we talked about, there's different styles with grieving, and so it's not necessarily true for everybody. So perhaps for some that is true, but not for everybody. Human beings are naturally resilient to loss. There are many who are resilient to loss, but there are many who find grief difficult or even disabling. Number 7, it's easier to accept a death after a prolonged illness. The idea here is that if we're already grieving the death before the person died, we may have less shock or maybe less grief, but in reality, all deaths are hard. Each death is difficult in its own way. And I think Dora's going to talk briefly about anticipatory grief as well. And then number 8, some types of losses are more difficult than others. All losses can hurt. Some may have more trauma inherent in the loss, so there may be additional needs for the griever, but all loss is painful. I think sometimes, like I said, I mentioned we have a tendency to compare, and so I find it's helpful if we can just remember that all loss is painful. And then number 9, each day it will get a little easier. This is not true because most people get surges of pain from time to time, even years later, and so that's also part of grieving. Let's see.